you very much for coming for our last session of the workshop series, Social Analysis of Penalties Across Boundaries, that is organized by the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, the Crime and Society Program of the National University of Litoral, and the CRIM of the University of Coruña. So we are hosting today, and we are very, very happy of hosting Professor Ana Vigna. She is Professor of Sociology at the Faculty of Social Sciences in the University of the Republic in Uruguay. She has been doing a huge amount of work of social research on prisons in Uruguay and have produced many, many interesting things in the last years. And today she will present us a paper titled Change, Resistance and Convergence Through and Beyond Uruguayan's Prison Reform. So as we usually do, we will have something like half an hour for Anna's presentation, and then we will have time for comments and questions. So the entire session will last around 1 hour. Thank you again, Anna. We are very happy of having you here. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, nice to see you all. Thank you for joining. And sorry for my horrible English that it's getting worse and worse each day, but I will try to do my best. I would like to really thank Máximo and Richard and all the team that is developing this really interesting space of debate and interchange, for having invited me to share with you my work. So we try to share my presentation. Let me know if you can see it, please.
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Well, as Máximo said, the presentation is called Competing Conceptions of Authority and Prison Order, Changes, Resistance, and Convergence Through and Beyond Uruguayan's Prison Reform. And this is a work that is somehow derived from my doctoral dissertation, which sought to examine how two categories of prison staff, police officers and civilian prison officers that are called operadores penitenciarios, conceived of and exercise power within the Uruguayan prison system, and in particular in attention to a prison reform process that took place between 2010 and 2020 in our country. So in this work, I try to address, on one hand, the way in which these changes were lived and conceptualized in the midst of the reform process itself. And on the other hand, I try to analyze their effects in the medium term, looking back at that process from a certain distance. So just to share with you some thoughts about the theoretical framework. With my work, I wanted to discuss with some classical debates in literature that picture prison staff occupying an intermediate position between distant hierarchies that have many difficulties in supervising the way in which prison officers carry out their work, and the incarcerated population that not necessarily recognizes them as legitimate authorities. So besides that, they must act as transmission belts for guidelines that are frequently vague, contradictory, and changing. And in this process of reform that I studied, it was especially the case. So in this context, I believe that Hepburn's typology of basis of power that he distinguishes between among positional, expert, referent, coercive, and reward are quite useful in order to think about the resources available to prison staff to secure compliance among the incarcerated population. So all these elements place the idea of the problem of order at a central place in prison dynamics, where power, as you all know, is exercised face to face and in an ongoing basis, and where discretionary allocation of benefits and punishments constitute key mechanisms for the maintenance of everyday order running. So I use a lot of concepts taken from the specialized literature. Some of them are coming from organized sociology of organizations, institutional discussions, and others specifically about prison studies. So before continuing, I want to share with you some thoughts or information about the context in which the prison reform took place in Uruguay. So after I mean, Uruguay doesn't escape to the general context of prison collapse and crisis that is quite common in Latin America. And after decades of denounces on torture, abusive treatments, and inhuman conditions, in 2010, it started a process of prison reform within what we call the progressive era that took place between 2005 and 2020 in Uruguay. So the main goal of this reform was to fight overcrowding and to improve prison living conditions. A second key element was the shift in the main aim of imprisonment that was historically related to retribution and deterrence, and it was intended to change for the idea of rehabilitation and human treatment. The shift was inseparably marked or linked to the process of depolicialization and professionalization of prison staff. Because until then, most of prison officers were police officers, but not only police officers, but street police officers that didn't have any specific training, neither any motivation to work in prisons. And in fact, many transfers to the prison setting were derived as a form of managing misconducts. So many of them had only primary level of education, and as I told, they were trained mainly to persecute and combat criminal activity on the streets. So the creation of this new figure that was the operador penitenciario begins in the middle of this prison reform, and in fact it was a centerpiece of the depolicialization project. But there were many structural weaknesses from this outset. They didn't have any statute that regulate their function. They didn't have any framework related to the use of force by these new officers, and there were no systematic plan of replacement of police officers. So all these elements limited the scope of the real change that was intended in the context of the prison reform. Beyond the notorious changes that were intended to take place within the prison system during that period, other transformations were simultaneously unfolding. In particular, the country experienced during these years a sharp increase in levels of violent crime. In this way, public insecurity has been entrenched for years as the primary concern in public opinion, and tough on crime rhetoric was steadily gaining broader support. Against this backdrop, following 15 years of progressive cycle, a center-right coalition took office in 2020, intensifying punitive responses and consolidating a law and order discourse. So let me tell you some words about the methodology I used for this study, because it tries to combine two moments in time. Uh, the first empirical approach that took place in 2016, and it was about a systematic empirical inquiry based on qualitative fieldwork, conducted in different units around the country that implied different levels of security and living dynamics. And there I conducted 35 in-depth interviews with police and civilian officers, men and women that work in different functional areas of those units. And the second approach addresses the post-reform phase through administrative data, interviews with institutional authorities, and also unstructured observation. So this could be a little bit schematic, I know, and of course there is a wide variability within each type of officer, but findings could be summarized in this way. First of all, police officers exhibited, and in relation to their working style, police officers exhibited a preference for control and for showing who is in charge, even if that implied restricting inmates' mobility and access to rights. On the other hand, civil officers emphasized their need to establish a relationship with inmates, even as a way to access to valuable information to prevent conflicts. In the second place, the base of power in the case of police officers was the uniform, which represented their ability and also their willingness to use coercion, whereas in the case of civil officers, it was their credibility, their ability to manage inmates' expectations and fulfill their promises. In the third place, I found that both types of officers preferred to solve conflicts through informal means, and that preference was intensified with tenure and experience within the system. In this respect, turning a blind eye was a very frequently tool used by both types of officers to keep everyday routine running. There was a clear difference in the way in which police and civil officers perceived the new attempts created in the context of prison reform to rationalize the use of force and the growing scrutiny of external actors, as for example the judicial system or even the public opinion. On one hand, police officers believe that the sanction process had become, in the context of prison reform, too bureaucratized, and they frequently feel the need to embody themselves the social mandate of punishment, as legal sanctions were often perceived as not enough. On the other hand, civil officers generally perceived that the disciplinary board, that was a board created in the context of prison reform, was a valuable tool to depersonalize the implementation of sanctions. Finally, the meaning of the concept of order itself varied enormously from unit to unit, and in the most problematic ones, it practically means the ability to manage conflict, avoiding the transcendence beyond the prison walls. So, as time went on, these two positions tended to converge. On one hand, police officers gradually adjusted to the new institutional framework and the discursive shifts, while on the other, the innovative and disruptive momentum of the reform slowly faded. In this context, the perception of civilian incorporation as a threat to the prison order, understood as an established state of affairs with a police base, gradually lost force over time, and the much heralded depolicialization process failed to take hold. In fact, operadores penitenciarios, these civil officers, never exceeded 32% of the total staff. And that threshold was reached in 2016, after which the proportion steadily declined. So, going to the concluding reflections, and just to sum up, the changes in the organizational mission and in the conception of inmates driven by prison reform signified a deep break in the hegemonic prison values that privileged security, discipline, and order. The intent generated a strong resistance against the entry of civil officers. In this conflicting situation, the training and the normative possibility to make legitimate use of force was established as the main distinction between police and civil officers. But additionally, the knowledge regarding the traditional way of carrying out the task was emphasized as a privileged source of power by police staff. So, while the reform process succeeded in a way in establishing a national prison system and advancing a right-based approach to incarceration, it fell short of achieving several of its core objectives, such as guaranteeing dignified living conditions for the incarcerated population, eradicating overcrowding, or the depolicialization of the system. So to summarize the central argument, Uruguay's prison reform succeeded in establishing a new institutional architecture and a human rights discourse, but the traditional occupational culture, sustained by the monopoly of coercion, accumulated trajectory, and a deteriorating security climate, proved enormously resistant to changes. So, more or less, this was what I wanted to share with you, and I'm happy to listen to your comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.